prefer that you guys sit closer to the projector so I don't have to project as much and so that you can see the images a little bit more clearly. In front of you, you have a quiz. If you have not taken a class with me before, the quizzes are meant to be filled out as I lecture. So you don't have to memorize it or wait all the way to the end. You'll have them available to you the whole duration of the lecture. And as I go through the information, your answers will pop up. It's really more so a way for me to be taking attendance because you guys are so large of a class. I can't be taking attendance every single day, so that's kind of your attendance slip. All right, so we're gonna get started. Today we're gonna talk about our first lecture on city planning, and we are gonna start with medieval city planning. So we're gonna see a lot of very interesting patterns, and hopefully you guys can begin to read city maps a little bit more deeply. So before we begin the unit, just kind of an overall view of what we're going to be doing. We're going to be analyzing how geography affects the site of a city and how its patterns reflect geographical features sometimes. We're also going to be looking at how politics can be read from an urban plan. And you'll notice from today's lecture that politics play a huge role in what kind of buildings are going to be in the center, the patterns that we're going to have emerge. We're going to talk about how the passage of time affects urban planning, right? So cities are built layers on layers on layers. So how does the medieval grid become affected when you have Renaissance, Baroque, and modern planning kind of layered on top of all that? And how can you still identify it today? And lastly, and most importantly for you guys, how do architects play a role in urban planning? Right? Does anyone remember what kind of city this is, what kind of culture this belongs in, just by the context clues of the site plan itself? We did look at this exact plan last semester. Yes?
Is it a graded plan and it's Roman, right?
It's not Roman. It's
Greece.
Yes, it is Greek. So how do we know that it's a Greek plan? Well, first of all, remember that the Greeks they didn't necessarily have a uniform concept of what a city was across all of Greece. They had a general toolkit of different things that they could place onto the city, but the actual plan of the city really varied from city to city, right? And remember that they based themselves on topography. So by reading this plan, right, we know that we have our stadium down here, and remember, for the Romans, they tended to use colosseums a little bit more, and if they did have a stadium, they would just put it in the center of the city. We also see that we have our temple all the way towards the top, which tells us that that is the Acropolis, right? The sacred ground that is raised above everything else. And then lastly, we see the center of civic life. Does anyone remember what that's called in a Greek city? So we have our Acropolis, and then we have the Agora, which contains a stoa. So the stoa was the marketplace all the way around our Agora, right? And notice that it's not a perfect square, it's just generally gonna be a rectangular piece, right? So it is Priene in Greece, and if we look at that with its topography, we can begin to understand why it looks the way it does, right? So just beginning to read context clues based off of what you guys saw last semester. Does anyone know what kind of settlement this is? It's not Greek. Yeah.
Roman.
Yep. So it's the other option, it's a Roman one. And how do we know that it is a Roman one? Well, first of all, it's a little bit longer, so Roman forums do tend to be a little bit skinnier, much more axial if you guys remember. And then we can begin to look at the footprints of the buildings, right? So I did leave the names off on purpose. Does anyone want to take a stab at what any one of these buildings are within our Roman Forum? Yes.
Number 2 is a temple.
Yes, number 2 is a temple. The temple was moved into the Roman Forum because they wanted it to have more of a central location. They also did not base themselves on geography, right? So they're not going to have a high point. They just put it in the middle, and then it aligns to the axes of the Forum. Yes.
9 is basilica.
Yes, 9 is our basilica. So remember, the basilica is a really wide aisle in the center, open air, and then the two side aisles. And remember that this is their court for law. And if you know that, we already know that the Romans had a very strict law code that they enforced in every single city. And that almost every single city looked exactly like this, right? It did have its basilica, it had its curia or bolitarian, it had several temples, marketplaces, all of it was found in the center, so that no matter where you went in the Roman Empire, all of them looked very similar, right? So this is how you can begin to apply your context clues from last semester onto this semester, and as we go through the lecture and actually begin medieval planning, you'll see what I mean. So some questions that you should always be asking yourself when looking at urban plans. Number one, can you easily identify the town center? Usually you are able to do so, and if you can, or if you cannot, that's going to indicate the passage of time and the abandonment or the replacement of another center. So sometimes you'll notice that a city has 2 different nodes to it, or sometimes 3, and it's up to you to be able to look at the context clues to know which is the eldest or oldest one and which is the most modern one. So if we think about Las Vegas, for instance, if you look at a map of Las Vegas, the downtown grid is a little bit tilted, right? And it's a little bit of a denser grain. So we immediately know that that would be the original part of Las Vegas, but then if you begin to look at it a little bit closer, you'll notice that there are other nodes to it. Downtown North Las Vegas, right? You'll look at the Strip, and we know that these are other nodes, but that they happened later in time, right? Because they're not at the center, because of the grain, because of several context clues that you guys will begin to learn as we go along. Secondly, what kinds of buildings are in the center or not in the center? Because that's going to tell us who is in charge at what point in time. So you have to be able to recognize footprints. Specifically, as we go through our historical periods, churches, palaces, town halls, really big castles, that kind of thing, because that's directly linked to politics. So that tells us who's in charge and what kind of political system they're using at that point in time. The third thing, does the center of the town look organic or does it look master planned? Because that's going to tell us if it kind of sprang up in an environment that had authority or in an environment that did not. So what do I mean by that? If you have a town that grew out organically, it probably started out as a really small group of farmers or really small alliance of merchants, and they're not always going to be focused on planning or architecture, right? So they're just going to start making streets wherever it's most convenient. And so it's going to generate a very organic looking plan, which is usually what we see in Europe. Whereas the master planned communities, right, if you look at New York City and honestly any city in the United States, you will notice a very neat grid for the most part. And that tells us that when these cities sprang up, there was at least some sort of authority and idea of what they wanted to do at that point, right? Or if you look at something as basic as town square, right? Town square is master planned. We know that there was a singular entity that kind of designed the whole thing. It did not spring up over time and organically. There was authority there, and that's why it looks the way it does. And the last thing you need to be asking is, what geographical features are near that town? Because that's going to tell us when the city was founded, why it was founded, and what their inhabitants do. So if we think all the way back to Sumeria, to our very early lecture last semester, right, or even the Egyptians, remember that all of them sprang up around rivers, because rivers allow you to have crops and they allow you to trade, right? You can use the river as a means of transportation. So if our city is based on a river, we know that trade and agriculture are going to be pretty important. So we can assume that a great majority of them are going to be farmers. On the other hand, if our city is based on a very high point, right, in a very secluded area that's hard to get to, it's probably built in order to generate defense, not so much agriculture. So that tells us that whoever built that city was scared of being invaded, they grew up in a time period where there was a lot of warfare, and so forth, right? So these are the 4 things that you should always ask when you look at a city plan, and this doesn't just apply to this class, it also applies to when you get your studio projects and you get the context of a site. You need to know these answers in order to create a building that suits that environment. So unit breakdown, you probably saw this in your syllabus already, but this is what we're gonna be studying. So today we're gonna start with medieval cities, then we're gonna go into the Renaissance, the Baroque, and then we're gonna break things down more or less by the century so that you're able to identify the layers that begin to form on each of these cities. So let's start with medieval Europe and what it is. So we have the fall of Rome around 500 CE, right? And remember that that fell because they were invaded and they had a very weak structure at that point. They had spread too thin. And then eventually we get a Renaissance in around the years 1450, 1500 or so, right? So in between we do have 1,000 years, and that is why we call them the Middle Ages, because they're in between the old or the ancient era and then what we call the beginning of our modern era, right? So the Middle Ages, they're also known as the Medieval Ages, or inappropriately known as the Dark Ages. And it's called the Dark Age because there wasn't a lot of innovation going on, or at least that's what the Renaissance thinkers wanted us to believe, right? So in order to make yourself look more enlightened and smarter, you have to assume that there was nothing interesting going on in the middle, which we know is false because you saw all those amazing Gothic cathedrals and all the structural innovations that were in fact going on in that time period. Now, what is true about the medieval ages is we do have a lot of warfare, right? So when Rome falls, we have an enormous vacuum of power. We no longer have an empire, and so what happens is you have everyone kind of going to war with each other, trying to take over that portion or their respective portions of land. And this goes on for 1,000 years, and honestly, it continued on for another 1,000 years, right? We constantly have wars up until World War II. Things aren't very stable in Europe. And so when you have wars for power, you don't have a lot of time to think or to produce a lot, including your food. So your resources are going to be very scarce during the medieval ages, and because of that, they were a very dangerous time to be alive because people were constantly killing each other trying to get their resources. And so cities generally are going to be designed to protect during this time period, right? Agriculture is still important, but when we look at the city itself, what is the most important thing that you need in order to protect a city?
City wall.
Walls.
Yeah, you need your city walls, and so the city wall becomes the single most important thing or structure in a city during the medieval ages. So this is a general map of Europe at the time, right? So think about the fact that the Roman Empire encompassed everything you see down here, here, up until around the middle of Europe and even England. And all of that was unified under one empire. And now we have all this fragmentation going on, very, very small principalities, lots of borders, which means lots of wars, right? And you're not just going to war with one kingdom, you're going to war with 5 to 6 kingdoms at a time. So it's super dangerous and you don't have a lot of resources to go around. Right? Who's currently fighting for power? Well, if we think back to our hierarchy, right, on this grid or this diagram that I love so much, you always have to look towards the top to know who is in power and therefore who's going to be or who are going to be the major players in this warfare. So first off, we do of course have our king, or what we call princely rule. And we call it princely because it's not always a king, right? There are certain places where it's a prince that's in charge, or a duke, or a baron. But what we do know is that it is part of the nobility and that structure, right? And usually the structure that is associated with them is of course going to be our palace or our castle. So when we're looking at European medieval maps, if you see a castle, we know that it had princely rule at some point in time. Our other option is going to be related to the church, which is of course going to be bishop rule. It's not pope rule because the pope is only in one place, right, and that's the Vatican. But everywhere else, right, you do have your local leaders, and those are going to be your bishops. So in some towns, we do have the bishop become the main ruler. And of course, the architecture that goes with that is going to be our cathedral. So if you see a major church that happens to dominate the center, it's probably going to be the bishop that's in charge of that town. And then we do have a third option, and this does begin to spring up, especially in Italy. If we look at our kind of third protruding tower, we do have our independent towns with our merchants and our craftsmen. And remember that the merchants did meet in our town palace, or Palazzo Pubblico, which had its tower, its staircase, and this is where you voted in who was going to be in power, right? So these are more an oligarchy structure. So if you see that we have the town palace in the center, then we know that it's a town ruled by merchants, right? And you can have all three at the same time, but this is where you have to start reading the hierarchy, right? Which one is more in the center, which one dominates more, which one blocks off the other one from being in the center, because all of that's gonna tell us who was in power and at what point. All right, so today we're gonna be moving through 4 different archetypes. I'll show you how each of them work, how to read each one of them. So the first one we're gonna be looking at is our radial city, linear, our Roman grid, and then our new foundation, or our Bastide city. So we're gonna start with the radial city first. As the name suggests, it does radiate out from a central point, right? So you have a central nucleus, and then you have all these different veins kind of spreading out from the center very organically. So they are not very straight streets. They're usually gonna be crooked and curved because you wanna kind of deviate it to the point that's most convenient. And when you don't have a master planner, right, if you live on the outskirts of town, you're gonna have to make your road go through all of these existing buildings to get to the center. And so the streets are generally not gonna make a lot of sense, which is why if you look at medieval Paris, it's really a maze, right? And even today, a lot of Americans don't really understand the whole concept, and they get lost because it's not a perfect grid. You have to understand how the city works and how it emerged. So the radial city happens because people want to be as close to the center as possible to have the greatest access to goods and services. Because what's in the center of a town? The market, right? So if you want to go get your grain and your meat every single day, or if you want to go to a banker every single day, you want to be as close to that center as possible. So it's going to be the densest in the center, and then it's going to get progressively less dense as you get to the outskirts. And as far as the value of land, it's going to be more expensive in the center, right? And this is still true today for most European cities. It's really the US that has a different structure, more or less, right? So the US does favor suburbia more than the inner city sometimes, but generally in Europe, the center is gonna be the most expensive. And then our city walls are gonna be circular in shape, not only because that's the shape of the city, but because it's cheaper, right? If you were to build square walls, those corners are extra linear feet of materials, so you really wanna reduce it to as little as possible, which is a circle. All right, so this is an example of a radial city. You'll notice that it is not a perfect circle, but when you look at that center, which we know is somewhere right here, we can begin to see how these streets radiate out from that central point, right? So you can see this one leads to our entrance over here, this one goes over here, and again, they're not straight because they're trying to work around the things that are already there, and there's no central planning authority. What kind of power structure do you guys think Carcassonne had, just based off the big building we see in the center?
Princely?
Yes, it did have princely rule, and we know that because what we see in the center is a castle, right? This is not a church, and it's also not a town hall, and then notice that it does have its own moat around it, right? So the prince bishop, or the prince, is in charge of protecting the town, but they're also in charge of protecting themselves, right? So it was not uncommon during medieval ages that your whole town would rise up against you, and so they had a moat, not just on the outside of the city, but also on the outside of their particular castle. So this is what it looks like, and this is where geography begins to play a role. So notice that it is on this really steep hill, which means that geographically it's perfect because you have a high point, so if you have people invading you, you can attack them from the point of advantage. Now on the other hand, it's a disadvantage because you can't spread out as easily, right? People generally do not want to be building on lands that has elevation. So they seek the flat lands at the bottom and then the top, right? And it kind of remains contained there for a very long time to this day. It's still very much in its medieval shape, right? Here is that bridge from our original collage, right? So this is where I grabbed it from. But you can see it's a very medieval town, right? We have a layer of protection here with the natural river and crossing this. And then you do have a secondary level of protection with the moat itself, right? Very narrow entryways. You don't want invading armies to get in there easily. And then you also want places to shoot people from, right? So you have these little windows up here. There's one of the entrances. This was a super cool sculpture. I just wanted to show you guys really quickly. This is not Photoshop. These are real circles that are painted on, right? So these are aluminum sheets, and they were put all over Carcassonne so that if you stand right here, you will see concentric circles. I know it's really hard to believe that it is not Photoshop, but this is in fact real. Just thought it was really cool. All right. So the city wall, right? We already talked about it briefly, but it is, again, the single most important structure for any city to defend itself. Some cities, as you saw with Carcassonne, do have multiple walls, right? So they have a first ring that maybe does become a little bit outdated or maybe begins to erode over time, and so they build a secondary city wall. And sometimes, right, once you have the invention of things like cannons, you have to upgrade your infrastructure because the walls that you would have originally built can now easily be knocked over. So you need to reinforce and build a second wall that is now cannon-proof where you could prop up your own cannons, right? Or where you could prop up your own artillery or whatever kind of new technology you have. I did talk about the princely palaces or the castles sometimes having walls of their own to defend themselves. So it's also in the case, assuming we have our enemies come into the city, they can take the townspeople, but they won't be able to get into the castle, right? So you have an extra layer of protection for yourself. And then we also have to remember that our walls do have a secondary function, which is taxation. So it's not just for protection, it's also to generate money, to build new walls, to continue protecting yourself, right? So how does that work? If you are a farmer, right, you're gonna be on the lowlands in the agricultural area, and so when you cart in your produce to sell in the city, you do have to pay a small tax, right, to enter the city, to have the privilege of selling to the townspeople. And so with this money, they're then able to fund themselves, right, and increase whatever it is that they're trying to do, their growth, their infrastructure, their marketplaces. But this specific function is going to play a role in how the city develops, which we'll see in the linear city. So keep this taxation in the back of your mind for now. So we're going to continue with Carcassonne, right? So these are the interiors. This is the space in between our two walls that I'll show you briefly. And this is the type of street that we're going to be seeing for a very long time, right? Very narrow. When you're working in medieval cities, you're not really thinking about having a lot of street space, you're thinking about having a lot of real estate. You want to be as close as possible, you want to have shops, you want to have as much as you can into that small city structure. And so streets are really not all that important, right? You don't need them to be too wide. So this is just to give you a general idea of what it's like to enter one of these, right? So we do have our fortifications, assuming you make it over. You do have your standard drawbridge, right, which you would obviously bring up if you were being invaded. We do have our moat, which you can see is incredibly deep, and that would have been filled with water at some point. And then we get into this area where you can see the older city wall and then the new city wall that they had to build, right? So you can see this one is quite short compared to that one, which means that if you were invaded and they were to get into this point, they would still have to get through that secondary wall, which is a lot more difficult to get into, right? So they could be out there for a while, which is also why they had the common practice of just starving people out. So they would just wait out here until eventually the people inside surrendered because there was no more food, right? So that was another tactic they used. Now, assuming you get into the actual city itself, right, you can begin to see those narrow streets I'm telling you about. Still very commercial even today. And eventually you do reach a small city center. Just gotta keep going, right? And this is exactly how radial cities work. You take any street and it will inevitably lead you to some kind of town center, which we can see here. It is quite small, right? It's not as big as we might imagine town squares today, but this is a luxury to have in a small medieval city, right? Because think about it, you could easily have another building here, but instead the citizens together, right, they decide that they would rather keep this as an open space to have their market. I did mention that princely rule, the castle, so you see it over kind of in that far corner. It does have its own bridge, which we see right here, and its own moat, right? So you get a whole other set of walls, meaning that the prince in this town had 3 layers of protection to themselves. So that's a general overview of what the radial city is. Now we're gonna move on to our linear city. So as the name suggests, it is gonna have a central kind of linear road more or less, and then all the other branches are gonna be perpendicular to it, right? So instead of having a single nucleus, the nucleus is instead going to be a big line. The reason that they develop this way is because of geography sometimes. So if you do need to go along a ridge or a river, you want to get as much of the town on the river as possible, so you might develop it into a line. Or if you have a ridge, right, you can't really spread out in a certain direction, so you just kind of have to spread along the edge of it. The other reason it could become linear is because of growth, right? So assuming that Carcassonne or a small radial town wants to begin to grow, it's not gonna always do it uniformly in rings, right? It might just do it in a certain direction. And so then we have a new axis that we're forming, which creates another form of a linear city. And the walls for it are usually gonna be very oval shaped, right? A lot longer than Carcassonne is. All right, so for our linear city, I am gonna be showing you an example of how a city goes from being radial to being linear. So it's gonna get a little bit messy, but hopefully you can begin to see some of the patterns. So this is Bremen. It is located in Germany. Here's a close-up of the area that we're gonna be working with, right? So I think you can see the overall footprint of it is quite long, and we do have this kind of linear artery going in right here. But how did they get there? Well, they did begin as a radial city first, right? So in the red, we have more or less the original footprint. If I take that off, I think you can really see where those original city walls would have been, right? So anytime we have a super wide road or a very interestingly shaped road that doesn't seem to make sense, that's usually a sign that a city wall used to be there at some point, right? So if you look at these other smaller streets, right, they're gonna be a little bit thinner because those are just your average streets. But these right here where the city walls used to be are thicker because city walls are pretty thick, right? And you can also see we have one out here as well where that row of houses would have been. So that's also where the original city wall would have gone as well. Now, we do need our entrances into the city, so we do see we have one here, here, and here which remain, and then we can assume that the last one was right here, right? And I'll show you why we can assume that it's that place that was our entrance to the city. We have our town center, so we immediately identify that, and we know that that's gonna be the center of our civic life. That's where our market's gonna be held, so now we have to begin looking for the clues of what is located there to tell us who's in power. So we see we have a town hall, right? A Rathaus, as it's called in Germany, Palazzo Pubblico, as it's called in Italy, right? And this is what the one in Bremen looks like. So we know that this is a town that is ruled by its merchants because it's right in the smack center. However, we also see that there is a cathedral over here, right? So we know that there is probably a bishop here, but because the bishop is not centered in that main square, we know that they are not the ones with the main authority here, right? It's the townspeople or the merchants that have the most power. And then we can begin to see how this is radial, right? So we have all these streets radiating out from the center very organically. You want to be as close to it as possible. So it looks very similar to Carcassonne for now. And then lastly, we have that, So if I take that green off, you can begin to see how we do have a wider opening right here, right? So it's a little bit bigger. And the reason for that is when you're someone that's selling produce, right? Assuming you have your fields out here, you're gonna be hauling over, let's say, watermelons, right? Watermelons are very heavy. You don't necessarily wanna go all the way to the center of town to sell them, right? You kind of just wanna pay your tax, get in as little as possible because it's a heavy load, and then you wanna sell them and leave. You don't wanna go all the way into here. And so over time, we do begin to develop a secondary marketplace in this space right here, which is why you see it's kind of this bigger funnel, because it at some point was a secondary market. And eventually, the people that begin to sell their goods there decide that they don't want to pay the tax to go inside to sell it, right? Why would they do that when they could just set up out here and people can just cross over the moat, buy their goods, and come back into the city? Now obviously that's kind of dangerous to do because you don't know what could be out there. So you do kind of have to choose, right? Do you want to have a cheaper watermelon but have the danger of being kidnapped out here, or do you want to pay a little bit more of a premium fare to have the security of having your watermelon inside the city walls, right? So these are all things you have to think about during this time period. There's that secondary market that develops. And now I'm going to introduce you to the concept of what a faubourg is, right? So we're going to go back to that map, but eventually those people get tired of having to come in every single day and they begin setting up outside the city wall, right? And so we have what we call fake cities spring up outside those walls, which we call faubourgs, or faubourg, right? Like faubourg. So usually they're there because people want to have the benefits of living in the city or trading in the city, but they just don't want to pay the price for it, right? Or maybe there's just not enough space anymore. So they begin setting up outside, and eventually they formulate a little mini town of their own outside of those city walls. They don't have to pay any taxes, which is good, but they are also in danger of being attacked and being the first in line to go if they are ever attacked, right? So eventually what happens with faubourgs is the city decides, how about we just expand our city walls to include them, and then that way they can pay us taxes, and now they have protection. And usually it's a pretty good relationship, right? Everyone wants that deal. They want to be part of the city itself. And so that is how you begin to accumulate land in your city and grow it. All right. So we're gonna go back to Grandma, right? So we have our wall, city center, we have a road leading to this gate, right? And that's where our little marketplace is starting up. Now again, people begin to want to live near this area, so they're gonna start living here, right? And this is where, again, you have to think about geography. Why are they living there? Why are they not living maybe here? Well, we have a river on this side, so that's not a possibility. For whatever reason, they didn't want to do it on this side. The development just happened to spring up on this side, which maybe their agricultural fields are all of that side, right? So it would make sense they would move in here. So eventually we get enough people and they begin to enclose that wall, right? So now we have this whole extra development, and Burma decides that they want that taxation. So what they do is they expand their city walls, and so that is why today there's no wall here. They tore it down so that now these people are incorporated, and they rebuilt their wall out there, right? And while they're at it, they do increase the fortification of that entire wall, right? So if you look at these kind of spiky pieces right here that are sticking out, that tells us that cannons were around at the time, right? So usually a pretty simple wall is just, you know, early medieval, but once you begin to have these, that is where you would place your cannons. And so you do need to have a broader city wall where you can have places to locate machinery. Right, so now we have our city center all the way over here. And we develop our linear artery. So now it's transformed from being a radial city to being a linear city. This is now the artery that matters the most. And you can see they even developed their own church down here, right? Right, they want to have a secondary local church, but still it is the Ratshouse or the town palace that is the one that's in main power. And coming off of there perpendicularly, we do have all of our secondary streets, right? And this is how you can tell that it's a linear city, right? When all of them kind of butt into it perpendicularly. If they were all coming out of random centers, it would just still be a radial city. But because we can identify this pattern, we know that it is in fact now linear. Now the third type of city we're gonna look at is the Roman grid city. So just because Rome itself fell doesn't mean that everything they produced disappeared altogether, right? So in medieval ages, they do still use a lot of the infrastructure that the Romans built, and they just build upon it, right? And that's where we get our idea of a Roman grid city. So it is based off of their military camps. Remember that the Romans are very conservative, and they kind of just have a singular law that they apply everywhere, and that goes as far as their building codes. So wherever the military sets up a new base, it's always gonna look the exact same, it's gonna have the same street structure, and it's gonna have things in the same location. Which is why when you look at Roman cities or grid cities, you'll notice that they do have a very standard look to them. So characteristics of it, it's gonna be a square footprint. The Romans liked to make square cities for the military camps. It's usually gonna try to align to cardinal directions over geography, if they can. It's gonna have a strong north-south axis, which we call a cardo, and then an east-west axis, which is called the decumanus, right? So it's always gonna have some kind of crossroads, and then in the center, it's gonna have the forum. It's gonna be around the Mediterranean because obviously that is where Rome was. So the closer you are to Italy, the more often that you will see this particular city type. And then another kind of small detail is if you look at it from an aerial perspective, if it looks pink or red, it's most likely gonna be a Roman grid, right? Because they used a specific pigment in their tiles. Versus when you look at Germany or you look at northern France, it begins to become more gray, a little bit more ashy, and have less color. And so usually you won't see that in a Roman grid, right? So just those really small things to keep in mind. The walls for this are gonna be square, and we'll see that during medieval ages, the square begins to break apart, but it's still kind of there. So this is what a military camp or a castrum looks like during Roman times. So you can see it's kind of just a city with 4 quadrants. So we have our cardo going north-south, our decumanus going east-west. And if you notice, it's not aligned to the river, right? They could have just turned it a little bit so that it would align very nicely with that river, but instead they choose to keep the cardinal directions because again, they always want the cardo to be north-south, and that way they keep uniformity throughout the empire through built form and architecture. There's the cardo, and there's the decumanus. And in the center, you're gonna have the forum. So this is the grid of Florence. Florence did begin as a military camp during Roman times, which is why in the center it looks like this. And I did show you this on our first day of class, right? I broke it down for you and I showed you these rings of expansion. So now you understand why Florence's grid is a square, right? It does have a authority that oversaw this, which was the Roman Empire. That's why it looks that way. But as soon as you step outside of that grid, you can see it begins to get a little bit crazy, it begins to have wonky streets, because that was medieval development, where they did not necessarily have any sort of planning committee to tell people what to do. And when you don't tell people how to build, this is what happens, right? So you have these streets beginning to curve in order to have the shortest distance to the river, right? There's the original grid. There is the cardo and there is the decumanus. And of course at the crossing is the forum, which to this day is the very heart of Florence. Now, what do you guys notice about the center of it? What is there or is not there?
Plaza.
It's a plaza, but what kind of building do we not see there?
No church in the center?
Is there
Yeah.
the town hall outside of the grid, or just outside of it?
Yes, one of them is. So we do have our main church, which I'm going to address first, right? The Florence Duomo, the huge one, the one that we talk about all the time. Notice that it's not in the center, right? It could have been there, right? You could have easily just demolished a couple buildings and put it in there to mark it as the most important building, but it's not, which tells us that Florence is not a town that is ruled by a bishop at that point in time. Instead, we have a town that is ruled by merchants, which, if you recall back to the Renaissance lecture last semester, it was the merchants that helped Florence grow back up, right? This is where the Renaissance was born, because merchants now have money to spend on public works, on art, and so forth. And yes, we do have multiple town halls sometimes, because the Medici family, if you recall them, they are located up here, right? They're not necessarily insiders to that grid, so they want to bring all of that influence out here where they are. So that is why we also begin to see the center of power begin to shift over time, because you have power political entities telling it to do so. And you can even see out here, we do have other things playing into where the center should be. Now, what do you guys think this was? It's an oval, right? So what do you guys think an oval shape meant during Roman times?
Colosseum.
Yes. So we have our amphitheater, right? This is where the Colosseum would have been, right? Or their version of the Colosseum. So that is another hint that this is a Roman foundation, and you can see that the streets today still work off of that. So the ancient foundation of the amphitheater still exists underneath the city itself. If you were to dig up those basements, you would find the vomitories of the ancient amphitheater inside of there. So eventually Florence begins to grow, and I want you to notice that we do have a kind of a little bit of master planning going on here, right? So all of the hatched area is what is inhabited at this point in time, so 1333. And then notice that we do have a city wall, but it's not really at the edge of where people live. It's much more broad, right? It's more spread out. And the reason is that they foresee that they're gonna grow, and so they build their walls just a little bit bigger to have empty plots of land, right? So now it becomes very desirable to come to live in Florence, because you can buy a cheap piece of land out here, you have the protection, you're not necessarily in a very dense area, right? It's a very nice way of living during this time period. And then you can see that by 1584, a lot of it has filled out by then, right? Notice we have a street all the way to that outer edge over here that is now perfectly populated. So at this point it was quite empty. And then now we begin to see settlement has moved into that area, right? And as people begin to buy plots of land, they're carving out the streets to go past their personal houses. And that's how we begin to get this sprawling of streets radiating out from the grid itself. Another Roman city is the city of Lucca, which is also very well preserved. So we have our castrum right here, right? Our cardo, our decumanus, and then we do have our amphitheater in this case. So we can see it's very neatly laid out, right? There is the original Roman grid. There are our cardo and decumanus. How do we know that that is the cardo or that that is the decumanus? Usually that's where the city walls are, right? Or the city gates. So if you notice, the street does come out from this end and from that other end, by which we know that this is going to be the most important streets, because otherwise it would not have a gate there, right? So at some point we did have a city wall that was a square, and it had a singular opening at this point, which is why we have such a prominent road there even today. There is the amphitheater. Right, here's another view of it. So you can see that in this case, the amphitheater is even more pronounced, right? It's actually a full oval shape, the center is empty, and if you look around the base of it, what do you see? You see arches. So again, these are the original vomitories of the amphitheater in Lucca. And this is what happens when you leave an amphitheater alone for a while, is people begin to build their houses inside of it, because it's kind of a mini natural city wall. So when Rome collapsed, everyone just kind of moved into the amphitheater, built their houses inside of it, they terraced it like this, but you can see the original foundations remained, right? And then over time, as you begin to construct, deconstruct, and remodel, you get what we see today. And notice that even their agriculture was inside of there, right? They were really scared to just step 1 foot outside of the amphitheater. Right, so once again, we have that. And then I want you to look at what buildings are or are not in the center, right? So we have our natural center over here. That is a church in case you cannot see it. And then we also have a secondary church out here. So we know that it's a really interesting relationship, but we know that at some point we have a central figure of authority that is a bishop, but then for whatever reason we have another major church built over here marking a second square. So we know that there was some kind of tension going on between its religious leaders at some point in time, just by looking at the city map. Now the one in the center is called San Michele in Foro. What do you guys think Foro means? Yeah, it means forum. So a lot of the names of these churches are clues as to where they are and what the history of that city is, right? Because that is the ancient Roman forum. So they keep that in the name. So in the case of New York City, Wall Street is not called Wall Street for no reason. That is where the original wall of New York City was, on the southern end, right? So certain names in cities are clues as to what used to be there at some point in time, right? Can anyone identify the style or the time period that this church is from? Yes?
Is it a Mendicant church?
It is not a Mendicant church. Those were usually on the outskirts of town. Yes?
Romanesque.
It is a Romanesque. It is a regional Romanesque with the Lombard screen, right? So what does that tell us? Being able to identify the style of the church tells us when it was built, which tells us when the bishop was in power, right? So if this was a Carolingian cathedral, we would know the bishop was in power in the 800s, but being that it is a Romanesque one, we know that they were in power somewhere in 1000 to 1200, because it's still not Gothic, right? So this is why it is important to remember your 201 stuff so that you can read these a little bit more easily, right? And if you don't remember by the exterior, you can remember by the interior. It is massive, right? It does begin to have vaulted naves, but it's still not as airy as a Gothic cathedral. So we know it's a little bit earlier than that. Here's another example. Now this one's a little bit more complicated, so we'll go through it. This is the Roman city of Albenga, right? It is also a Roman grid. We do have our Cardo going up and down, and once again, we know that because there's gates, right? The blue right here and the blue up there are our city gates where you would have entered. And we have our decumanus, which is a little bit more obvious just by how broad it gets at those ends. Now, what do we notice is missing at the crossing of these two?
Square.
Yes, there is no central square, there is no central forum here. Where do you guys think the forum originally was? Just based off the architecture you see around those two streets, which of the four corners was the original forum?
Was it right there?
Just tell me like northwest and northeast, top left. Which one?
Southeast.
Southeast. Okay, another guess?
Northeast.
Yes, so it is our northeast corner, which we see right here, right? So now we can very easily see we have a forum delineated there. That's where it should have been. But instead, we have this interesting, large, kind of square donut where the interior is empty. What prototype is that? We did learn about it last semester. Who has enough power to build inside the forum, take over it, and build something that enormous that is a square donut with an open center? The ruling merchant family. So remember, the Medicis, the Rucellais, all of them could afford to have the city palazzos, which looked like square donuts, right? And more so to just build it in the center. This is the entrance to the city, right? So if you enter through the Cardo, it is marked by this gate. What style is this? What time period would this have been from? When do we see them have the rebirth of classical orders?
Oh, Renaissance?
Yes, it is a Renaissance entrance, right? So we know at some point during the Renaissance, they tore down their medieval fortifications and they decided to beautify the city by giving it a more Renaissance look to it. These are the streets of Albenga, right? So very narrow once again. If you look down here, sometimes when you have this pavement, that means it used to be a gutter, right? So you have to look at the floor for its patterns as well. What do you guys notice about this arch? The proportions of it, at least.
One's Baltimore.
Hmm?
Or one's pointing right and the other's.
It is pointy, I think it's just the angle, you can't see it. But proportionally, what is wrong with this arch?
It's really short.
It is really short. So this would have originally been around this tall, right? But what happens over time is, it was really nasty, but people would just throw their trash, right? And you'd have horse manure all over the place. People would just throw their things out onto the city streets. And so over time, you begin to have buildup, and then they would just kind of pave over it to make it pretty. It would get dirty, and they would pave over it once again. So you probably have around 4 to 10 roads underneath this one, with just layers of trash in between. And that's how you begin to build up the level of your city. So that at this point, what would have been around 12 feet tall might only be around 8 feet tall, right? This is another example, right? So if we look at this is the height of what an arch should be today. And then this is what the height of an arch was during medieval ages, which today you can barely crawl through. So we know that it's risen around 6 feet by now. So there's 6 feet of trash underneath this city that's just been compressed over time to form the new ground, which is why sometimes it is very unstable to build in these areas, and you do need to create very deep foundations. You just don't know what's underneath some of these. Now I do want to go back really quickly because I want to show you what's going on in the center. The easiest way to do that is by looking at the map itself, right? So we talked about our forum, right? Our forum would have been here, and you can see today that it's fragmented, it's been broken up into different apartments, but that originally this would have all been one united donut like we see in the gray, right? And that would have been our original city square. Now, there is a church here, right? And it kind of carved out a very skinny space for itself. So we know that the church has power, but what we also see right here is a town hall, right? So we're gonna go inside of there, just so you can see the relationship more or less, right? So that is our church, and then over here, hidden in the little corner, is the town hall. Now, does anyone remember what the 5 characteristics of the town hall were? What does it need to be a good town hall? It does need a tower in order to mark it as the most important spot. That's one.
Meeting hall,
It does need a meeting hall on the 2nd floor marked by the window.
balcony,
It does need a balcony, a loggia, and then the last part, where do the people vote from?
oh, I swear.
It needs a square in front of it. Now, if you notice, this is tucked in behind this little corner so that there is no square there, right? And notice that the staircase is facing this direction. So we know that the original square in front of this would have been where the church happens to be. So from that, we can then begin to read back the layers and go, okay, I know that at some point that was the ruling kind of merchant city, and this would have been where people voted from. But over time, it became a bishop city, which we know because the bishop had enough power to block out that square and put the church here instead, right? And once again, if we read further into that, notice that the little town hall is right next to our family palazzo, right? So we know that probably one of the ruling merchant families that worked here built that right next to it, which is quite convenient, and that this would have been their square, right here. But since this was built, and we know that the church was built after the fact, and that therefore the power structure changed at some point in time. All right, is all of that beginning to make sense? How to read the layers and the time? Right, so showed you the height of the cities. There's the town hall, right? You can see how it's been blocked off entirely by the church. And then there was a little baptistry just behind it. So these are the steps up to that town hall. And we do have this little baptistry on the side that took over this extra little corner. Remember, in Italy, they do like to separate it. All right, so the last one we're gonna look at, that should really say number 4 on there, is gonna be the Newtown Bastide. So these cities were founded during the Middle Ages, right? The Roman grid was all the way back to Roman times, and then they built upon it. But these are brand new developments during the Middle Ages, and they were master planned, and all of them are gonna look very similar. So the characteristics of the Bastide grid compared to the Roman grid are the footprint's gonna be longer. It's gonna be much more rectangular versus square. The grid pattern of the blocks are also gonna be more rectangular. So whereas the Roman ones are square blocks, these are gonna be long linear blocks. They're usually gonna be a little bit neater because they were planned during the medieval ages, and so they weren't built over during the medieval ages, right? Uniform plots of lands that are 8 meters wide, 20 meters deep. We know that historically because, again, it was master planned with a certain intent, and we have the documents that tell us that it was this way. They also have sewer protection and fire protection, which is huge during the medieval ages because fires tended to sweep away entire cities at a time, right? And the reason is you didn't have any space between buildings. So what they did in the Bastides is they gave 30 centimeters of space, which looks about this big, in between buildings. But even those 30 centimeters went a long way in protecting the building right next to it, right? So these did tend to last a little longer because of that. They also have an open city center with arcades around the perimeter. And they don't usually have a castle or a church in the center or even a town hall. They're just arcaded, which we'll see why that is. And then brown or gray roof tiles. And we'll talk about why that is as well. I'll leave that up for a little while longer. So Bastides are usually found in the south of France, right? And there is a political reason for why that is. So if we think back to what I told you about the tiles, in France, they don't favor the kind of orangish red as much as they do the brown or the gray, right? And the norther you go, or the farther north you go, you will see more muted colors compared to the Mediterranean. So we're going to be talking about this pink section down here, which is the Duchy of Aquitaine, right? And the Duchy of Aquitaine had a duke, right? And he had a daughter, and he didn't have any sons, and so Eleanor of Aquitaine becomes the heiress of this entire plot of land right here, which is huge. And at this point in time, it is not part of France. So the French king obviously becomes quite interested in her, right? She's a single woman with all of this to inherit. It is a great match on both sides, right? She becomes the queen, and he inherits all of that land. And so she marries King Louis VII of France, and now this becomes the entirety of the French kingdom at the time. Now eventually, things go sour between them. She can't give him a son, and as it usually goes, he divorces her, finds someone else to give him a son, and her lands are actually given back to her. So France goes back to just being this upper portion here. And now she is, again, a single woman with all of this territory, which is a problem during this time, right? Because it meant that you were likely to get abducted and forced into marriage. So the easiest thing to do was just find your own marriage to go into. And what she did was marry the King of England, right? So now the French king is angry because the English king now has a claim to all of this, which is basically his home turf, right? So now England is right next to them versus being away on their little island. And that becomes a big problem. So the French king grows quite angry. He tries to go to war for it. And so they eventually have a kid, right? He didn't get his mother's look. So we have Edward I of England. And he tries to lay claim to this, right? He knows that he's in trouble because the French king is trying to take over it. So what he does is he kind of has this new legislation that he passes in order to create settlements. And this is where the Bastides come in. He decides, let me settle new towns, right, that are nicely organized, that have good authority, safety for people in this area so that they like me, right? And then he shares that with the barons. So the Bastides are ruled by both the King of England, this guy, and the local barons. And why does he do that? Because once he starts taxing them, if he takes all the tax for himself, he's just gonna make the barons here angry, and if they're angry, they're gonna side with the French king. So what he has to do is say, we're gonna split the revenue, right? So I'm bringing you more revenue, which means you should support me in our war against France. And so that is why England did have a very huge claim to France for a very long time. And this is what the Bastides look like. And again, they are master planned by the English court and their architects to look like this. Very rectangular, right? All of them are gonna have a central square, and it's all arcaded. So this is a shaded area that's underneath an arcade. And then we do have freestanding shades sometimes. Now, why would that be good? Who benefits from having a shaded area in the square?
Merchants.
Yeah, the merchants benefit from this. So these towns are really directed towards merchants who can afford the taxation, and they want a really nice, clean, open square to sell their goods in. And so by attracting the merchants, you are now generating wealth for this area of France, or England in this case. So this is Montpensier in France, right? You can see the tiles are a little bit more muted, and we do still have our central square. Notice that the grid is very, very well preserved. It is not as eroded as the other ones because, once again, it is master planned. There is the central square. And then notice the church is just kind of off to the side, right? So it's not that the church isn't important, it's just that it's not the ruling thing here. Why? Because the king and the baron are giving the merchants, right? They're giving their prominence. They're giving them prominence right here in order to keep them on their good side. And this is what the city square looks like. So I'm gonna show you just really quickly. It is a very, very large square comparatively, right? So if you were to come from one of those Roman grid or the radial cities, this would look enormous to you. And therefore, if you're a merchant, you might be willing to relocate here because it's a much better deal for you. You have more space, it's cleaner, and it's safer. Now recall I did tell you about those 30 centimeters, right? So if we look in between each one of these, there is a super tiny gap right in between them, and that was their form of fire code protection, right? So that's our central authority there, and notice that everywhere you look, we do have arcading. It might look a little bit different because uniformity was not really a thing during medieval ages, but it's still there, and it gives you the opportunity to have lots of merchants in that area, and they're safe and they're covered from the elements. And on this side, we have an even larger one, right? In the very center of that. Now very quickly, I do want to go back to show you that church. So we're going to reorient ourselves. So the church is right here, right? Notre Dame. Again, all churches in France are called Notre Dame. And if we place ourselves in front of it, you'll notice that there is no square, right? Because again, the church wasn't the one with power. There's those shopping arcades. Here is our gutter plumbing system, right? So all of the waste from your home would just kind of flow past here. And then eventually they did cover it up because it smells bad and they got modern day plumbing, but that's how it would have worked in that day and age. And that would have been considered very sanitary, right? Compared to just throwing it out your window with a bucket. There is a close-up of the church. What time period do you guys think this was built in? What type of church is this, by the look of it? Yes. It is not Gothic. Remember that Gothic focused on skeletonized walls. Yes. Also not Carolingian. So it's the one in between. It is our Romanesque church, right? And we know because it's quite solid very heavy. There are a couple windows, but it's still not as tall or as light filled as the Gothic ones. It's not nearly as tall. So therefore, even if you didn't know the whole history of the two kings fighting over it, you would know that whenever this was founded, it was during that Romanesque period, 1000 to 1200. Some more images. And that's kind of the end of the lecture, right? So really quickly, before you guys get up, I did want to share, I did put up your first collage assignment. Everything you need to know is inside of there, right? So just open up the assignment. You do have a sign up for a city, right? So there's still lots of spots open. Just choose any one of them. I promise you all of them have something interesting to them. You can make a good collage of every one of them. The instructions are found right here. So this tells you everything that you need. I do have a small schedule that I would adhere to right here. So although I'm not going to collect anything until February 25th, I would recommend you get started immediately because you do need to go through a couple of steps, right? These are your deliverables. This is your format and the materials that you need. The grading rubric, and then a template for the size of this thing, right? So read through it. We'll talk about it more on Thursday once you guys have a city. If you guys have any questions, you can ask me on Thursday. Does anyone have questions on the lecture itself? All right. If you don't have any questions, please turn in your quizzes up here.